The sea had a way of whispering secrets in that little coastal town, secrets the wind carried through the narrow streets, past the cafes, and into people's lives. And then came Sophie Laurent. She wasn't the kind of woman who went unnoticed. Late 40s, yet her confidence made her timeless. The way she moved, elegant, calm, deliberate, made people turn their heads and wonder, who is she? Her house by the shore, an old stone place with blue shutters, became a symbol of fascination. The town liked to pretend it wasn't curious, but everyone was. She told people she restored paintings, breathing new life into fading colors, peeling back the years one brushstroke at a time. It fit her somehow, that delicate touch of renewal. But behind those soft smiles and graceful manners, there was something unreadable in her eyes, a quiet tension, like a storm holding its breath. It made people both drawn to her and slightly uneasy, as if they sensed she carried more stories than she was willing to tell. At night, when the tide rose and the moonlight painted the walls silver, Sophie often sat by her window with a glass of red wine. She watched the waves crash, her reflection blending with the sea's darkness. To anyone passing by, she looked like a woman at peace. But if you looked closer, if you dared, you'd see something else, a flicker of longing or maybe revenge, disguised as serenity. The town's social season began with its annual charity gala, a glittering affair where gossip flowed faster than champagne. That's where Sophie appeared in full force, wrapped in an emerald green gown that seemed to shift colors under the lights. Every woman wanted to know where she'd bought it. Every man wanted to know who she was. She didn't speak much, but when she did, people listened. Her voice had warmth, but her words carried precision, like each one had been chosen long before it was spoken. And that's when Daniel saw her, a respected architect, married, admired, but quietly restless. One glance at Sophie, and something inside him cracked open. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, the kind that makes your pulse stumble and your reason retreat. Their conversation began innocently enough, about art and coastal architecture, but there was an undercurrent neither could ignore. She laughed softly, tilted her head, and time seemed to slow down around them. From across the ballroom, his wife watched him smile in a way he hadn't in years. Sophie noticed that too. She noticed everything. To her, Daniel wasn't just another man. He was a mirror reflecting a part of her past she thought she'd buried. And though she smiled politely and moved on, the spark had already been lit, a quiet, dangerous spark that would soon become impossible to contain. The following days brought coincidence, or so Daniel believed. A chance meeting at the gallery, a shared walk by the pier, a conversation about art that turned into a story about loneliness. But none of it was chance. Sophie knew how to orchestrate desire the way an artist builds contrast, light against shadow, truth against illusion. She wasn't cruel, she was careful, calculated. Every glance, every pause, every whispered, maybe next time, was deliberate. Still, there was something about Daniel that unsettled her. His sincerity, his gentle curiosity, it tugged at something deep inside her that she didn't want to feel. Because Sophie Laurent didn't fall. She lured, she observed, she controlled. Yet for the first time in years, control felt fragile. When he touched her hand goodbye one evening, her heart betrayed her with a single sharp beat. She turned away before he could see. As the sea murmured beyond her window that night, Sophie opened an old drawer and pulled out a photograph, faded, torn at the edges. A man's face, not Daniel's, someone else's, someone from before. She traced the outline with her fingertip and whispered something only the wind could hear. Whatever secret she carried, it wasn't buried yet, and Daniel, without knowing it, had just brought it back to life. Daniel told himself it was harmless. A few texts, a brief coffee meeting, the occasional late-night message that lingered longer than it should. But there was nothing harmless about Sophie. She had that rare ability to make a man feel both safe and exposed, wanted and unworthy, all in the same breath. Her words carried warmth, yet beneath them, there was an echo of something darker, something she didn't name. Their encounters grew more deliberate. A walk by the marina, where gulls cried over the sound of waves and the scent of salt hung in the air. Daniel would talk about his projects, his house, his family, and she would listen, not as someone curious, but as someone who already knew the script. When he laughed, she smiled. When he confessed his doubts, She nodded slowly, eyes gleaming as if she'd heard it all before. And then came the first touch that wasn't accidental, a brush of her fingers across his sleeve as they stood in the fading light. It was brief, innocent to anyone else, but to them, it felt like a crossing. Daniel left that night with his heart racing, the taste of her perfume still haunting him. Sophie watched him go, her smile fading as soon as the door closed. She turned to her reflection in the glass, whispering to herself, "He's ready." Every story of desire has a rhythm, and Sophie knew it by heart. She slowed things down, drawing him closer, one breath at a time. Her messages became shorter, her presence rarer, each absence building the craving she wanted him to feel. When they met, she'd let silences stretch between them until Daniel filled them with words. His secrets, his regrets, his longing for something he couldn't quite name. She fed on those confessions like oxygen. At times, she felt almost guilty, almost. There was a part of her that wanted to believe she was giving him something real, a spark, a reminder of life before it became predictable. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just passion she was chasing. It was power, the ability to make a man forget the world, even for a moment, to remind him that loyalty and love were fragile things, easily undone by the right smile, the right touch. Late at night, in the flicker of candlelight, she'd look through her collection, a small box hidden behind a false panel in her wardrobe. Inside, photographs, letters, and keepsakes from men whose names she no longer spoke, each one a chapter of a story she swore she'd finished. Yet here she was again, writing another. Only this time the pages felt heavier, the ink darker. Daniel began to lose sleep. He'd wake before dawn, staring at the ceiling, replaying her voice in his mind. At work, he found himself distracted, sketching the curve of her face in the margins of his blueprints. His wife noticed the distance, the unfamiliar silence at dinner. But when she asked what was wrong, he just smiled faintly and said, "Nothing really." The lie came too easily. Sophie, meanwhile, kept her calm exterior. But when she was alone, her mask slipped. The thrill that once felt empowering now flickered between pleasure and guilt. In her quiet moments, she'd open that old diary, its pages filled with names, dates, fragments of memories, and there, scrawled between two entries, was one word that still haunted her: Lucienne. She closed the book with trembling hands. Lucienne, the beginning of everything she'd become. She whispered his name like a curse, then lit a cigarette, watching the smoke coil upward like a ghost refusing to leave. Outside, her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel, just 3 words: "I need you." Sophie stared at the screen for a long time before typing back, "Tomorrow, my place, starting over, about them." Sophie listened, her expression unreadable. She didn't want a new life with him. She wanted to keep him in the dream. But dreams are fragile, and Daniel was starting to wake up. One evening, he arrived unannounced, rain-soaked and trembling with desperation. "I can't keep pretending," he said. "I need you." Sophie froze, her heartbeat sharp against her ribs. For the first time, she saw in his eyes not desire, but devotion, and that terrified her, because devotion was messy. Devotion asked questions. Devotion could destroy everything. The town began to notice, the whispered glances, the awkward silences when Daniel's name came up, the way Sophie's curtains stayed drawn during the day. And then came the journalist, Elena, young, curious, and too perceptive for comfort. She'd been researching an old scandal for a local column when she stumbled upon something strange, an unsolved case from another coastal town. A man, married, found dead, a suicide note, a mysterious woman seen with him weeks before. The name on the report had been different, but the description uncannily familiar. Elena started asking quiet questions. A woman in the cafe remembered Sophie's face from somewhere. A retired policeman recalled the case. A pattern began to form, one Sophie had spent years burying. Meanwhile, Sophie herself was unraveling. Nights became longer, her dreams heavier. In flashes, she saw herself younger, standing in a storm, screaming a man's name into the dark. Lucian, the betrayal, the humiliation, the fall. Sometimes she'd wake up gasping, convinced she could still smell his cologne, hear his laughter. That laughter had driven her mad once, when she discovered his affair, when she realized she'd been the fool. The memory burned like salt in an open wound, and maybe, just maybe, that's when something inside her had cracked for good, pleading for reassurance. But Sophie had grown distant, detached, her replies colder, shorter. She watched him fall apart and hated herself for feeling both pity and satisfaction. He reminded her too much of Lucian, his charm, his promises, his weakness. She wasn't punishing Daniel. Not really. She was punishing the ghost that still haunted her. Yet the line between past and present was blurring fast. One evening, as she walked by the shore, Sophie caught her reflection in the water, hair tousled by the wind, eyes hollow with fatigue, and for a fleeting moment, she didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back wasn't the elegant, controlled Sophie Laurent. She was someone else entirely, someone she thought she'd buried long ago. And as she turned back toward her house, she saw a shadow waiting by her gate. Elena, notebook in hand, eyes sharp as a blade. "We need to talk," the journalist said softly. Sophie smiled faintly, but her pulse thundered in her ears. The past was no longer a ghost. It was standing right in front of her. The storm came without warning. Waves crashed against the shore like an angry heartbeat, and the town went quiet, as if holding its breath. Inside her dimly lit house, Sophie faced Elena across the room. The journalist's notepad lay on the table between them, open, accusing. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Elena said. Her voice wasn't cruel, just steady. Sophie didn't answer. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. The storm outside answered for her. Elena leaned forward. "The man in Arcachon, the suicide. His wife said he was having an affair with someone new, someone who disappeared the day after he died." Sophie's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy. For years, she had outrun the truth, reshaped it into art, into seduction, into survival. But there it was again, her reflection in another woman's grief. "Why are you doing this?" Elena asked quietly. Sophie laughed then, a brittle, broken sound. "Because once I was her," she said. "Once I believed in forever, and he destroyed it." Her voice cracked. "I just wanted them to feel it too, the loneliness, the silence." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky like an echo of her confession. And in that sound, Sophie realized the storm wasn't only outside, it was her. Daniel came later that night, soaked from the rain, frantic. He'd heard whispers, seen the article draft Elena had left at the cafe. "Tell me it's not true," he begged, his voice trembling. Sophie looked at him, the man who had become both her comfort and her punishment, and something inside her finally broke. "It's true," she whispered. Every word. She told him everything then. How her husband, Lucian, had betrayed her, left her for another woman and humiliated her publicly. How she'd lost her mind for a while, trying to understand how love could vanish so easily. And how, one night, Lucian ended his life, leaving her with the unbearable weight of guilt and shame. Since then, every affair had been a quiet reenactment, a way to balance a scale that could never be evened. Daniel stood in silence, rainwater dripping from his hair, his heart shattering with every word. "So I was just another name in your diary?" he asked. Sophie hesitated, her lips trembling. "At first, yes," she said softly. "But then, I forgot to hate you." That single sentence hung between them like lightning, bright, violent, and gone too soon. The door burst open then. Daniel's wife, Claire, her eyes fierce with betrayal. She'd followed him, her pain etched deep. "You destroyed my family!" she hissed. Sophie turned toward her, calm now, the storm within her quieting. "No," Sophie said gently. "It was already breaking. I just exposed the cracks." Claire's slap came fast, sharp, but Sophie didn't flinch. She welcomed the sting. It felt honest. Elena, who had returned with a recording device, stood frozen in the doorway. This wasn't the confession she'd come for. It was something far more human. The mask had fallen, and what remained was not a villain, but a woman who had loved too deeply, lost too painfully, and avenged herself too cleverly. Tears slid down Sophie's face as she whispered, "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just didn't want to be forgotten." As lightning flared through the windows, Sophie sank into a chair, her face pale in the flickering light. Outside, the sea raged, washing against the rocks as if trying to erase everything. And in that wild chaos, there was something almost cleansing, something that hinted, faintly, at release. But whether that release would come through forgiveness or ruin, that, not even Sophie knew yet. Excellent. Let's move into Chapter 5, Redemption or Ruin, the final act of Sophie's emotional journey. This chapter will keep the same structure, 3 blocks, each with 3 paragraphs of 6 lines, written in an intimate cinematic tone. The mood, poetic, bittersweet, and reflective, a quiet aftermath filled with consequence, grace, and the question of whether Sophie will ever find peace. The storm passed with the first light of dawn. The sea, once furious, now breathed in slow, tired waves against the shore. The town awoke to the aftermath: broken branches, flooded streets, and whispers that refused to die. Sophie's name was on everyone's lips. Some spoke with disgust, others with pity, but no one, not a single soul, spoke with understanding. She had become the woman everyone needed her to be, the villain of someone else's story. Sophie didn't leave her house for days. The once bright rooms now felt like a gallery of ghosts. Every painting she had restored seemed to stare back at her, accusingly perfect. The phone rang constantly. Reporters, curious neighbors, and Daniel, again and again. She never answered. Instead, she sat by the window, staring at the sea as if it might carry away the ache lodged in her chest. And then, one morning, she finally stepped outside. The wind was cool, the air sharp with salt. She wore no makeup, no armor, just herself, bare, human, and utterly tired. As she walked toward the edge of the cliff, the gulls scattered before her, their cries lost in the vastness. It was the first time in years she hadn't been afraid to be alone. Daniel found her there, standing by the railing where the land met the endless blue. He looked different, worn, yes, but calm. "They're saying things about you," he said quietly. "Things that aren't fair." Sophie smiled faintly. When were they ever? There was no anger in her voice, only acceptance. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The truth had already stripped her bare. He stepped closer, hesitant, searching her face. "You could leave," he said. "Start over somewhere else. Nobody would know." She turned toward him, her eyes soft but steady. "No, Daniel. Running built this prison. Staying might be the only way to leave it behind." Her words were quiet, but they carried a kind of grace, an ending that didn't need redemption, just release. For a long moment, they said nothing. The wind tangled her hair, and he reached out, just once, to touch it. "I don't hate you," he whispered. "I think I understand." Sophie looked at him then, not as a lover, not as a victim, but as a man who had seen her truth and didn't turn away. And for the first time, she felt something close to peace. Later that evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Sophie stood by her fireplace, holding the old diary. Its cover was worn, its pages filled with the ghosts of her past. Lucian, the men, the pain, the revenge. One by one, she tore the pages and fed them to the flames. The fire crackled, devouring the evidence of everything she'd been. The scent of smoke filled the room, sharp but cleansing. Outside, the tide rose again, reaching toward the cliffs as if to meet her one last time. Sophie watched the horizon until the fire went out, then walked down to the sand. The sea was cold, the kind that numbs more than it hurts. She let the water reach her feet, felt it erase her footprints with each passing wave. The past, finally, was dissolving. When dawn came, she was gone from sight. Some said she left town quietly that night. Others swore they saw her walking along the shoreline, smiling at the rising sun. But the truth, like Sophie herself, remained elusive. All that stayed behind was her empty house by the sea, and the lingering sense that, somehow, she had found what she'd been chasing all along. Not love, not revenge, but peace.